people coming in, so definitely feel free to get started whenever. I will give you a 5-minute and a 2-minute warning when the time is almost up. If you would like any other warnings, just let me know. And thanks so much for hosting this workshop today.
Thanks so much, Becca, and thanks everyone for joining us. To all my colleagues across the state of California, as fellow teacher educators in this space, mentor teachers, it's an honor to join you. And it's kudos to the University of California team that organized this virtual conference, and inviting our private independent schools like USC to join you, as well as our Cal States. I've met and seen many of you at the Cal Council teacher education conferences, and as a result of their communication, it was great to be invited to join and submit a proposal for this conference. My name is John Pascarella. I'm a teacher educator of 22 years. I started in Newark, New Jersey, where I'm from. I was born in Elizabeth. And I went to 13 different public schools growing up. I was raised by a single mom. I grew up in primarily low income, racially and ethnically diverse neighborhoods. And as a result of that experience, getting to college, I realized that my experience as a white dude didn't line up with a lot of the white dudes I was hanging out with in college. Um, and it had been because of the neighborhoods and teachers that had been racially ethnically diverse, that had talked about race more explicitly with me as a young white person. That while I don't think my perspective was unique, it definitely shaped my perspective and was distinctive from a lot of my white peers in college who had grown up in what I'll call white bubbles, essentially. What the research shows, many white folks grow up in racially segregated, primarily working middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods. And so it was through this work that when I decided to become a teacher, the influence and decision around that were the many teachers who had created stability in my life in those classrooms. And my interest in working in schools and neighborhoods that reflected those I had grown up in led me to get a master's degree in teaching from the original normal school teachers college in New Jersey that was working in primarily urban low-income schools. I joined that track of the program, and it was through that experience that I learned a lot about teacher education and the extent to which faculty had the ability to work alongside student teachers was limited because they were stretched in multiple directions, research and publications, and other obligations to achieve tenure kept them really outside of the classroom. And so that motivated me to go into teacher education, to get a doctorate and be a part of a renewal process that increased our approaches to meeting the needs of historically underserved students. And it was through my undergraduate experience in African American studies that I learned so much about how much was left out of the curriculum in language arts, history, science, and math, the experts, geniuses, and characters and authors that had been left out of the curriculum. And now, in our current political context, are being banned as those new publications finally get to in the hands of children and teachers. So in this first section, I'm going to sort of frame the context a little bit about where we're at and with respect to unlocking the potential of culturally relevant curriculum. And as the title suggests in my presentation, it's going to be about thinking about implicit bias a little bit differently with respect to how we just break it down, how our biases imply messages to our students and how that can create distance rather than closer relationships. A few studies have been reported, published in the last few months. In February, the Pew Research Center released their Race and LGBTQ Issues in K-12 Schools report. And in it, this is just a snapshot. You can get this for free, download. I can also drop it in the Google Drive folder. They asked teachers a lot of questions about how they're perceiving the debates about K-12 education, what you hear in the media as the culture wars. and a sizable number of them reported that these debates and these fights, so to speak, that are happening in their school communities and in their teachers' lounges are negatively affecting their jobs. Along with that, they were asked about what they think about the legacy of slavery still affecting Black Americans today. They were also asked whether a person's gender can be different from or is determined by their sex at birth. And as you can see, just a snapshot of these responses that, and these are teachers responding, remember, that there are still significant numbers of teachers that believe that this part of American history does not affect Black Americans today, and that students should not learn about the legacy of slavery in schools. And we see different forms of ambivalence around understanding sex and gender identity, as reported there. And so what we wondered when we see these kinds of reports in the from the Pew Research Center is, how would teachers in your school respond to these questions? If you're faculty in a teacher education program like me, how would our fellow teacher educators respond to these questions? And what questions do these results raise about how teachers talk about race and gender in schools? And much of our work at the Race and Equity Center here at USC has looked at, examined these kinds of questions. To what extent do students learn about race, racism, identity diversity, gender diversity in their K-12 and their colleges and university experiences? Another report that came out from the USC Ed Policy Hub and the Center for Applied Research and Education that around the same time, I believe this one came out in March, was this report called Searching for Common Ground. And it's also available for free as a PDF downloadable. I'll post that in our Google Drive folder as well. And this looks at adults' overall support for activities parents could take when they disagree with classroom content. We've seen a lot of activism at school boards. Many times, the most vocal advocates against certain books, or those advocating for banning of books, or the censorship of what's taught about race and gender identity in schools, are oftentimes not parents or caregivers of students themselves in that district. The second thing that we've seen in these reports and in studies and reporting on these repeat requests to ban books is that those individuals often will be putting in over a dozen. A single filer will put in over a dozen book ban requests. And so it's the activism of individuals in school districts, and those two I think contextual points are important. And in looking at other studies, and I think Penn America has put out a lot of studies on this. They're done a bunch of reporting on the effects of some of these disagreements about what should and can be taught in the curriculum. So those are important as well. I'll post those in the Google Drive. So just looking at these figures, a lot of this data lines up with and is agreeable to many and or not surprising that the first line of talking to students, talking to their children about a disagreement at home is the predominant response. Contacting the teacher and explaining why they disagree with the lesson, voicing disagreement at a school board was actually significantly higher than past surveys of this kind of nature, this kind of question. All of this has implications for what our teachers, teacher educators, how prepared we are to talk to our teacher candidates, how prepared mentor teachers are to talk to a student teacher when the student teacher comes in to design and carry out a lesson that is identity conscious and relevant to the students' lives. And what does it mean to engage in productive discussions with parents and caregivers or community members who are raising a problem about what is being taught as it's being sort of represented in back channel communication or online? And so here's what we've seen across the United States and definitely here in California, as you probably have seen districts like Glendale Unified and Temecula Unified and Chino Hills. There are state regions across the state, districts across the state in which educators have been targeted. Superintendents and school boards have taken up curriculum issues. What's happening for the educators, the effects on them, professional isolation, negative evaluations, promotions being negated, hostility and harassment, not just from, let's say, parents who disagree or caregivers disagree, but outside community members that find out about what's happening online, social media, and targeting them or doxing them, finding out where they live and putting their addresses online. In addition to that, a loss of support from colleagues. Legal challenges are happening in various states where teachers, over 160 as of last year, as the Washington Post continues to follow the teachers who are losing their jobs as a result of legislative bans or gag orders on talking about race, racism, and or gender identity. In addition to that, administrative reprisal and unwanted media attention are some of the effects that have occurred. The impact on K-12 students is lesser known, not as well researched. There's less data being collected from K-12 students on their experiences. But what we know from the research literature, where researchers in education have studied what happens when the curriculum is not inclusive, when teachers are not inclusive in their approaches to teaching subject matter content, is that first and foremost that the content is inaccurate. It's incomplete. Uh, and that invisibility and erasure is one of the impacts of why students don't see themselves in curriculum. Um, the curriculum is underdeveloped and the students' knowledge is underdeveloped. And that means then misconceptions perpetuate. And then, of course, there's a loss of rapport and trust between the students and the teachers and the curriculum they're learning about. Um, and then, of course, we've seen the negative effects as well in these studies regarding racially toxic learning environments when teachers are underprepared or unable to discuss race and racism and identity in more explicit terms. At the Race and Equity Center at the college and university level, we have conducted what's called a National Assessment of Collegiate Campus Climates. I am leading work to extend this into teacher education programs this year and beyond because we don't know enough about the experiences of teacher candidates who are entering the profession. While there is a greater focus on recruiting and retaining teacher candidates of color, there has been little research on how they experience our programs and little research on what happens when they're working in clinical settings. Um, and so the NAC covers 6 important research areas in our surveys: mattering and affirmation experiences. To what extent do students feel they matter and are affirmed by the professors they encounter, by their peers? And with that, thinking about cross-racial engagement. To what extent are there social opportunities across different racial and ethnic identities? And to what extent do students benefit from those interactions socially, whether it be studying or it be extracurricular or just social outings? Looking at the basic racial literacy, racial learning, to what extent in their teacher education program experiences do they develop racial literacy skills? Do they talk explicitly about race and racism impacting their lives? And to what extent it will impact their students' lives? And to what extent can they develop a strong racial identity within their racial and ethnic identity groups? And then the appraisals of institutional commitment. Many of our programs put out a commitment or state explicitly on our websites that we care about equity. To what extent do we live that as teacher educators? Do we do the work ourselves as teacher educators? And then to what extent do our students encounter racial stress in our classrooms? Not just those that they experience in the K-12 clinical contexts, but in our teacher ed college classrooms. And then the last area of the survey looks at the impact of external environments. And so while we're only beginning to move into this area of research, and more specifically, some of the factors that we have seen in our climate studies and work with K-12 schools and teacher education programs have shown three distinctive patterns. One is that, generally speaking, our teacher candidates and our teacher educators encounter race-avoidant workplaces, classrooms, and campuses. The second pattern is that decision-making about curriculum, about program, about where placements happen are racially biased and not explicitly addressed, unearthed. And then third, we see in our curriculum our choice of which books to assign or articles to assign, and or how our policies with recruitment, admission, and retention are race evasive. Avoid generally taking up that topic. And of course, what we've seen with anti-DEI backlash policies across the different states, what we saw with the University of Texas last month laying off all of its DEI staff and department, is a direct response to efforts to be race inclusive, to increase racial literacy on college campuses. And so again, we are looking to explore what does that mean in teacher education programs. I'm going to show you a short video. I'm going to pivot to what this means for us as teacher educators. Do we see ourselves in this work, especially those who of us make very explicit commitments to anti-racist work? And to what extent do we model that while we have those commitments, that we're still engaged in a cycle of reflection around the ways in which racial biases show up in our own lives? And recognize the history of the ways in which we've been socialized with those biases. This short video includes an interview with our center's director, Sean Harper, and several other individuals. But I want to point out Sean because Sean is a known researcher in education and the intersections with our work here that we'll do today. So I'm just going to stop share for a moment, and I'm going to pull up that video for everyone. As I'm doing that, I just want to say anything that I show today is yours to use with your teams, with your students, be it the slides, the videos. I'll post those after today's session. The videos are free from the New York Times series they developed. They produced several years ago, 26 mini films on talking about race and racism. There's several really important and evocative videos, interviews with teachers, parents, and students. I encourage you to check out that series if you haven't seen it before. All right, let's see, share sound, optimize video. Okay, here we go.
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chug from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or Black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases, these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get, so they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors. So how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there's a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful, and you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class, whatever your interactions are.
One practical thing that people should do is take stock of their friends. It would be very useful for people to actually make lists of people with whom they spend time.
Look for patterns. That's the audit. That's the assessment we can all do.
Next time, some people say you should go out and make as many friends of different races as possible. But does that actually work?
So Sean was featured in that interview with the New York Times, and he also last year produced a series with Time Magazine and Zoom, a 9-episode video series. I encourage you to check it out. It's available for free. They put everything on there online, including some resources related to each video that they posted and produced. Sean regularly talks about in every session how we are socialized with these ideas about racial differences from birth. He's referenced several studies in that work, and we use that to inform how we approach this. The Anderson 360 series is another. There is a documentary series that they looked at with respect to children's biases and race. They did a multi-year study with some psychologists that interviewed several kids from kindergarten all the way up to secondary across racial and ethnic groups. And that's another series that's been really useful to working with teacher candidates and understanding that kids in early childhood are already forming racial biases about each other and about themselves, and internalizing those messages they're receiving from media, from parents, adults, and teachers. And so while this is a short session, if we had more time, I would take time for us to reflect on a moment after seeing that video, when you recognize the racial bias you had, how it came up in your private thoughts. Did you realize it on your own? Did someone call your attention to it? And recognizing that across racial and ethnic groups, there are racial biases that have been documented throughout history, people's experiences in sociology, anthropology, and in education. And so normalizing that experience of talking about, recognizing, and talking about racial biases, particularly in the context of preparing teachers to understand that our students, parents, caregivers, everyone is socialized with those biases as we are. And so unearthing and having productive discussions about it, call attention to our own personal histories and experiences with it. This work has been crucial to then engaging in any kind of work that looks at things outside of ourselves, such as others, the contexts we work in, and the policy structures, curriculum we want to change. And so we're talking about curriculum. We're also talking about ourselves. What's the work we're going to be doing with ourselves? Race and Equity Center joined forces with the Center for Urban Education that was founded by Stella Ben-Simone more than 2 decades ago. She developed several series of tools, including this chart, this table that looks at the difference between equity-minded competence and the lack of equity-minded competence. And that claiming not to see race or color blindness, as it were, is just an avoidance tactic to not really own one's own racial identity. So then what does it mean to be aware of one's racial identity? And then move to understanding some quantitative and qualitative data to identify racialized patterns of practicing outcomes. That means looking at things like your grading practices in your classroom, and also tracking attendance, and moving from a sort of deflected responsibility onto the student and their caregivers to a shared responsibility about what's happening in my classroom, and to what extent are my grades a reflection of biases and or taken for granted practices. And then moving into a space of exercising agency for producing racial equity in the classroom means that I need to work with more knowledgeable educators in the building who have experience and are committed to advancing equity in their classrooms, who are trying out different curriculum tactics and learning from mistakes that they have made, as well as an opportunity to inform how could I take a different strategy and approach in mind. And so in this next session, we want to begin, I really want to have an opportunity for you to turn and talk to each other about the experiences you've had, unlocking the potential culturally relevant curriculum in your teacher education classes, or as a mentor teacher in your coaching and one-on-one support for student teachers in your classrooms. So two things I want to sort of take up. One is, to what extent are racial topics integrated across your program? And how well prepared do you think new teachers are who graduate from your program or who have spent a semester in your classroom as a mentor teacher to integrate racial topics? Now, first and foremost, talk about what does racial topics mean to you? Because sometimes culturally relevant curriculum and or discussions of it avoid a discussion of race altogether. So why don't we start there? I'm going to give you about 10 minutes in breakout for you to really take up these two questions. We should probably shorten it given the time. I'm sorry. Let's do about 5 to 7 minutes. I'll pop into the groups as well. Let me stop the share. Oh, before I do, let me give you a chance to take a screenshot. Maybe you want to take a screenshot of those two questions to anchor your discussion. Let me just pull that back up as we're setting up the breakout. In fact, could you help me with the breakouts? Maybe 3 to 4 in a breakout room.
Great. Yeah, I can do that now. And I actually typed out the questions, so I'll send those in the chat too. And then I can also send those to each breakout room as well.
Thanks so much. Okay.
All righty, I'm going to send everyone to their breakout rooms now.
Thanks so much for taking time to connect with each other. I had an opportunity of listening in just for a few seconds in each group. And we're going to segue into, and again, we had more time today. This was a 2-hour engagement. We debriefed this a little bit more, but what I'd like to do is sort of prime you for the next opportunity to work with your small group. And I heard a lot of conversational points that were brought up that will inform this next round of discussion you'll have with each other. And so I'd like you to open this Google Drive folder, and in it, you're going to see a chapter from Ali Michael's book, Raising Race Questions. And I've just the first 2 pages of the chapter I've included there for you to take a look at. If you open that up, it's marked Ali and chapter 3. And I'd like you just to take a few minutes to read those 2 pages before we move into our next breakout group. Okay. In this focus on integrating racial topics and thinking about how teachers who are committed to building a more anti-racist classroom, ourselves included, sometimes make mistakes and have overlooked the realities of their students' experiences, how their students experience racism, racial bias. And so this example is one in which the author, who very much works week to week in classrooms with teachers and school districts who are attempting to increase anti-racist practices in classrooms, was called in to a situation where an incident happened in the classroom and the teacher, despite their efforts to recover, couldn't recover from the challenge it created with her students. So I'll stop talking. I'll give you a few minutes to read that, those 2 pages. Please let us know if you're having trouble accessing the resources. I'll show the slide again. Okay. And I'm going to move you back into breakout session so you have a chance to debrief that those 2 pages from that situation. Talk about the questions it raises for you with respect to how you've talked about culturally relevant and responsive curriculum and teaching practices with student teachers, with in-service teachers.
Great. Do you want me to send them right to the breakout rooms while they're reading?
So why don't we just stay here, and why don't we, if you wouldn't, maybe a general practice in Zoom is just to turn off your camera if you're reading. You can leave it on, of course, if you'd like, but turn off and then turn it back on when you're ready to move into small group. So we'll hold about 4 minutes or so to give you a chance to read that. Okay, we're going to move into breakout rooms and give you a chance to talk and debrief. I'm not going to give you any specific prompt. Just want to give you some time with each other to debrief what you saw as the challenges that the teacher encountered? Do you relate to those challenges in your own experience as teachers, as teacher educators? And to what extent do those challenges connect to the way you work with teacher candidates, support them, teach them to integrate racial topics, to diversify the curriculum? And what kinds of challenges have they encountered in those experiences? Please take a few minutes to talk with each other. Rebecca, can you help me with the rooms again?
Yes, I can open up those rooms now.
Thanks so much. Appreciate your help. And I know we only got 9 minutes. I know we only have 9 minutes left in our workshop, but I have some tools and resources to share with you that I'll spend, a few minutes just going over. But before we get there, I do want to give you a chance, and as a group, for us to debrief your experience in the breakout with limited time remaining. In the focus on integrating racial topics, bias and missteps happen that can cause and perpetuate harm and or create complexity, nuance that teachers are perhaps sometimes underprepared for and or didn't have the kind of experience in their teacher education classrooms that explicitly prepared them to engage in ways that would have prevented harm. So tell me more about what your perception experience of this situation provided for you in this conversation with your colleagues in your small groups. In other words, what do you think happened that the teacher could have anticipated? And what do you think the teacher's learning opportunity was in this situation? Start with the teacher.
Sean, this is Michelle Dean. We've been fortunate at Cal Lutheran to have worked with Sean a few years ago. He worked with our institution. He's incredible. The teacher should have read through it, understood it, front load of it, let the kids know. And also, when people teach things that are awkward or uncomfortable for them, co-teach it with someone that maybe has that experience. I'm sure someone in the community, someone that's affiliated with the school, knows about the Harlem Renaissance from an authentic perspective. Co-teach it with that person, female, male, of African descent. Sometimes kids will respect just because you look like them. The model, and I know it's sound, but it is because you look like them. You're a role model from their community. Always front load words about our color throughout history, or trigger words. And kids probably have that discussion at home. The N word goes to Negro, da 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 da. Those are trigger
Yeah.
words. And so people need to be understanding of that. But I don't know, awkward things I tell folks. Number two, I tell my teacher candidates, go talk to your parents. You're in your 20s. Go talk to your parents about how race impacted them and what they taught you in the home as you were growing up about race. And it's really eye-opening. I'm the discussion, I'm sure, of many dinner table conversations, but they need to know how they were taught about race or introduced to race as they were growing up as kiddos, and what are they going to share moving forward with their students. So that's just a couple things from Cal Lutheran.
Hey, thanks so much, Michelle. Others
I'd
want
like
to chime
to
in?
add a couple if there's time.
Yeah, go for it. Keith?
Keith Walters. I think the teacher really needs help being prepared to understand the dynamic interactions between intentions and perceptions. Because when I read about the teacher, she had very, very good intentions, but her intentions were not being perceived by the students in the way that she had hoped that they would be perceived. And if the teacher, I believe, was really taught how to navigate intentions and perceptions, the teacher would then become aware of the fact that she swung and missed. And if her intentions truly were pure, then she would be more willing to change and make adjustments and honor the students she's working with. So just some thoughts.
Thanks, Keith. Our center does a lot of work in this area around examining sort of what comes up for educators when mistakes, crises happen, incidents happen. And the subject of intentions comes up a lot. And one of the challenges in exploring that is the extent to which educators feel like they have a strong sense of their own racial identity, and whether they are willing to explicitly talk about their racial identity with their students, particularly when they do not share the racial identity with their students. And in this situation, the teacher did not have a strong sense of their racial identity as a white female teacher in this context. Now, that's the positionality of that teacher. That might be true of other teachers. However, put in the context of a curriculum and school system that has maintained white-centered, Eurocentric, white supremacy practices and that history and legacy, along with, as Michelle pointed out, the extent to which the differences in evolution of the use of terms, particularly by a teacher who does not share the racial ethnic identity of the students, is something that was also not explicitly talked about with the students in a way that they would have expressed their concerns about the use of that language prior to it showing up in the text in the book that the teacher used in her effort to make her curriculum more culturally relevant. So thank you so much, Keith and Michelle, for responding. I know we only have 3 minutes left. I have a lot of resources to share with you. I usually plan these things to be a longer engagement. And so if you found any of this beneficial and would like to partner together on any efforts you're leading in your teacher ed programs, please don't hesitate to reach out to me after today's session. I'll give you the highlights from what we learned from this, what our research shows in this area, and what we learned from this case study that we use in our sessions. So first and foremost, that strong racial identity construction is important. It's not just that our student teachers need to learn about race and racism, it's that they need to lean into what does it mean to be my racial and ethnic identity? How do I explicitly talk about that with my students from day one? Do I have a more comprehensive understanding of racism and the racial dynamic amongst my students? Not the realities I am projecting onto them, but the realities that they're voicing about their own experiences. And with that, am I co-invested in a process that's about building stronger rapport and listening and learning and not just assuming and projecting onto my students what the realities or what my knowledge of their racialization or socialization with race and racism might be? And then, of course, collaborating with more experienced race-conscious educators. And again, Michelle, thanks for your contribution earlier. And I think this also connected with some of the points that Keith offered us. To what extent are you really collaborating? Are you doing this in isolation? Because that's what we're institutionalized to do. We're socialized as teachers to work in isolation. And then working with race-conscious instructional leaders is also important. Grade level team leaders, department chairs, principals, are they committed to this work? Are they instructional leaders and not just compliance officers? And then with respect to policies and accountabilities that can ensure the work is supported. All right, I could show you this slides, but I just want to point out what they are. So when you look at them after today's session, the evolution history, culturally relevant to culturally responsive, the culturally sustaining literature and research is important. And more recently, Chris Emden's work on reality pedagogy is incredibly evocative and useful to this very case in which teachers think about what does it mean to have co-generative dialogues with students about race, racism, and or the extent to which we integrate racial topics in our curriculum. And so other research shows, windows, mirrors. The first thing that we saw was that the teacher, in fact, wasn't holding up a mirror to these students. She was offering them a window, but she wasn't thinking about how the students see themselves in their realities. And then thinking about the wide range of modalities that you can use along with primary and secondary source work, different digital modalities that students can engage in and produce themselves. Dialogue is a big thing. And I know we're out of time. I put in the chat this link to a great session by Professor Braha Lopez up at the University of Washington. He gives a great example of what it means as a math teacher to have knowledge of racial and cultural realities of his students, taking a windows and mirrors approach. This might be useful in your work with student teachers. And this last section It gives, again, more research-informed approaches to how teachers are becoming more effective at affirming students of color in their classrooms. Pulling from Rich Milner's work on disrupting racism and whiteness and the science of reading by asking these important race-conscious, identity-conscious questions. The curriculum, the culturally responsive curriculum scorecard that the New York NYU Steinhardt Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity has developed. Take a look at these resources that you might use and or experimented with. I've dropped the toolkits those free toolkits. I put them all in the folder and as well as the other reports that I mentioned in today's session. What they look at, what they help teachers do, work in professional learning communities to look at their curriculum to the extent to which they can assess it from being culturally destructive all the way to culturally responsive, and then develop ways to work to take a more culturally responsive approach. Again, not without the individual work that's necessary, teachers could still fall into the challenges that the teacher did and the case study I shared with you today. So this is a common way we use the tool. Again, use this. If you think this is a useful activity, take the slides, use it with your own classes. And this is only a sort of a primer to what you can do with student teachers and mentor teachers working with each other. Other implications, questions that can be useful in these conversations. I know I'm 2 minutes over time, so I won't read them aloud. And then importantly, and as we carefully at the center look at stories in the media of teachers that have used harmful tactics, here's what we've seen. Using role playing or imitating race-based identities and experiences is hugely problematic. And not assuming shared race-based realities when you make race-conscious content choices. And this happens within and across teachers who share racial and ethnic group identities with their students. Think, through Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality. While you might share a racial ethnic identity, you don't share the same age as that student or generation. You may not share the same gender or ideas about gender and sexuality as that student. So there's lots of intersectionality issues to consider. And so not assuming is important. Minimizing the effects. What does it mean to minimize the effects of a racist structure, policy, or decision in your discipline? So thinking about, well, these policies don't say anything about race. They should apply to every student. Well, research has shown that guess what? Policies about hairdress and or hair coverings and or clothing actually have a lot of racialized undertones that have not caught up with a more culturally responsive, race-conscious approach. And then oftentimes explanations when we're called out on bias or mistakes, in our attempts to avert, divert, deflect, anytime you find yourself moving into an under-researched or race-evasive explanation, pull back and say, you know what, I made a mistake, I want to hear you out, and I need to learn more about this. And we saw, again, these are research informed, meaning when teachers have made mistakes, and then on the flip side, what happens when they respond to mistakes. And here are some research informed strategies. Again, I'm over time. I realize saying these in a vacuum without further contextualizing them is not a best practice. But I do want to wrap up today's session and think about what it means to unearth joy in your classrooms, being more fully aware of what we impose on our students, the assumptions we have about them, the choices we make for them about curriculum, and the unexamined intentions we may need to overcome. We may continue to do the reflective work. The more we do that as teacher educators, model it, do it with our teachers, the stronger racial identity we express with our teacher candidates, the more likely they're going to follow suit. Okay, thank you so much for attending today's session. I'm 4 minutes over. I'm running into your lunch hour. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to connect with you and support your work as we attempt to do with all of our partners in that center. And think about partnering with us if you are leading new initiatives. We are a research nonprofit. We're not a private consultancy. We always look to find ways to work within budgets and or seek out funding with you to support initiatives. These are some of the things that we've done: equity-minded teaching institutes, racial equity leadership labs, we facilitated and partnered with school districts and teacher education programs for student leadership academies, as well as we've done a lot of equity-minded strategic advising for DEI task forces at, in colleges, universities, and K-12 districts. Please also look out for our free equity book talk series that we have. We feature and we've done in the spring. The recordings are on our website. And then, of course, we have equity practice briefs that you can download for free on our website. There's the link for that. Okay, enough commercial about the Race and Equity Center. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope this was useful to you today. I know we didn't get a lot of chance to talk in community, but I appreciate your participation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John.
That was
for a great
awesome, John.
workshop.